Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the trenches and poison gas clouds of a conflict that somehow managed to accidentally destroy four empires. Europe's finest minds convinced themselves that marching in straight lines toward machine guns was peak military strategy. We're talking about the complete history of World War I. And trust me, it's way more catastrophically world-changing than any high school history textbook ever made it sound. So smash that like button if you're ready for some seriously questionable decision-making by people wearing impressive uniforms. Hit subscribe for more stories about how one wrong turn in Sarajevo launched a 4-year nightmare that nobody saw coming. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now settle in because we're exploring how the assassination of an Austrian archduke with questionable fashion sense triggered a global catastrophe. How "let's just throw more men at the problem" became every general's favorite solution. And how a continent that just wanted to show off its shiny new weapons ended up witnessing the birth of modern warfare, the most pointless Christmas truce in history, and the complete collapse of the old world order that nobody really liked anyway, but at least understood how it worked. So grab your gas mask and your overly optimistic battle plans, because we're about to explore how the entire world decided to have the most expensive and destructive group project in human history. So there you are, living your best life in 1914, probably worried about whether your mustache is waxed properly, or if your corset is tight enough, when suddenly the entire world decides to have the most catastrophic group project in human history. World War, I didn't just happen overnight like a bad hangover. It was more like a slow-motion train wreck that everyone saw coming, but nobody bothered to step off the tracks. The whole mess started because Europe had turned into one giant powder keg, and all it needed was some archduke with questionable fashion sense to light the fuse. Let's talk about the state of Europe before everything went sideways. By 1914, the continent was basically a collection of empires playing the world's most dangerous game of Risk. You had the British Empire, which owned about a quarter of the planet and acted like they invented civilization itself. The German Empire was the new kid on the block, flexing its industrial muscles and making everyone nervous with their shiny new navy, and their Kaiser, who had serious daddy issues with his British relatives. Austria-Hungary was this weird dual monarchy that was held together by bureaucracy, coffee, and sheer stubbornness. Imagine if two people who barely tolerated each other decided to run a country together, and you've got the basic idea. Then there was Russia, this massive empire that stretched from Europe to Asia, ruled by a Tsar who believed God personally appointed him to run the place, despite having about as much political sense as a goldfish. France was still bitter about losing to Germany in 1870 and spent the next 40 years plotting revenge. Like that friend who never gets over a breakup, the Ottoman Empire was the sick man of Europe, slowly falling apart, but still dangerous enough that everyone had to pretend to take it seriously. The alliance system that developed was like a really complicated dating situation, where everyone's ex was dating someone else, and nobody could remember who was mad at whom. You had the triple alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, though Italy was about as reliable as a chocolate teapot and would switch sides faster than you could say, "Hasta." On the other side was the triple entente of Britain, France, and Russia, which wasn't technically an alliance, but more like three people who agreed they didn't like the same person at a party. The arms race was in full swing, with every country trying to build bigger guns, better ships, and more impressive uniforms. Germany and Britain were having a naval pissing contest, building dreadnought battleships like they were collecting Pokemon cards. Everyone was convinced that the next war would be short, decisive, and glorious, kind of like how people think they'll only eat one potato chip. Nationalism was spreading across Europe like a particularly virulent meme. Every ethnic group wanted their own country, every country wanted more territory, and everyone was convinced that their particular brand of culture was obviously superior to everyone else's. The Balkans were especially messy, with various Slavic groups wanting independence from Austria-Hungary, while Austria-Hungary wanted to expand further into the region because apparently they enjoyed administrative nightmares. Into this delightful situation stepped Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary, a man whose main qualifications for potentially inheriting an empire were being born into the right family and having strong opinions about hunting. Franz Ferdinand was actually one of the more reasonable members of the Habsburg family, which is like being the most sober person at a frat party. Not exactly a high bar. He had married for love, which was scandalous enough in royal circles, and had ideas about giving more autonomy to the various ethnic groups in the empire, which made him about as popular with the establishment as a vegetarian at a barbecue. On June 28, 1914, Franz Ferdinand decided to visit Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina, which Austria-Hungary had annexed in 1908, to the delight of absolutely no one except Austrian bureaucrats. This was like deciding to vacation in a place where half the population wanted to throw you a parade, and the other half wanted to throw you off a cliff. The visit was supposed to be a show of imperial strength and unity, but it ended up being more like a masterclass in how not to do public relations. The security arrangements for this visit were about as tight as a screen door on a submarine. The route was published in newspapers. The Archduke would be traveling in an open car, and the local police force was supplemented by a grand total of 120 additional officers for a city of 50,000 people. It was the kind of security planning that makes you wonder if anyone involved had ever heard of the concept of assassination. Meanwhile, a group of young Bosnian Serb nationalists, called the Black Hand, had decided that killing Franz Ferdinand would somehow solve all their problems and lead to the creation of a Greater Serbia. These weren't exactly criminal masterminds. They were mostly teenagers with more passion than sense, armed with bombs that were about as reliable as a weather forecast, and pistols they barely knew how to use. The assassination attempt started like a comedy of errors. The first assassin, Nedeljko Vabernovije, threw his bomb at the Archduke's car, but the driver saw it coming and sped up. The bomb bounced off the car and exploded under the next vehicle, injuring several people, but leaving Franz Ferdinand unharmed, and probably wondering why he hadn't just stayed home to shoot some deer. After this excitement, any reasonable person would have called it a day and headed back to the palace for a stiff drink and a long think about career choices. But Franz Ferdinand was apparently not a reasonable person, because he decided to continue with the planned visit to the city hall, where he gave a speech that basically amounted to, well, that was awkward, but let's pretend it didn't happen. Then came the decision that changed the course of world history. Franz Ferdinand wanted to visit the people injured in the bombing at the hospital. This required a change of route, which would have been fine, except that nobody bothered to tell the drivers about the new plan. So when the Archduke's car reached the intersection where it was supposed to turn, the driver continued straight ahead, according to the original route. When someone finally shouted that they were going the wrong way, the driver stopped the car and began to reverse, right in front of a delicatessen where 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip happened to be standing, probably wondering why his fellow conspirators were such terrible assassins. Princip couldn't believe his luck. Here was his target, sitting stationary in an open car, about 5 feet away from him. He pulled out his pistol and fired 2 shots. One hit Franz Ferdinand in the neck. The other hit his wife Sophie in the abdomen. The Archduke's last words were reportedly, "Sophie, Sophie, don't die. Stay alive for our children," which would have been touching if it weren't for the fact that this moment of personal tragedy was about to trigger the deaths of millions of people. Sophie died almost immediately, and Franz Ferdinand followed shortly after, probably never imagining that his death would be the excuse Europe had been looking for to tear itself apart. The immediate reaction to the assassination was surprisingly muted. Most people figured it was just another Balkan incident that would blow over in a few weeks. The Kaiser was on his yacht. The Tsar was doing Tsar things. and everyone assumed that diplomacy would sort everything out like it usually did. This was roughly equivalent to seeing a small fire in your kitchen and deciding it would probably put itself out while you went to check your email. Austria-Hungary, however, saw this as the perfect opportunity to deal with the Serbian problem once and for all. The Austrians were convinced that the Serbian government was behind the assassination, which wasn't entirely wrong since some Serbian officials had known about the plot. But it wasn't entirely right either, since the Serbian government hadn't officially ordered the hit. It was like blaming the entire school because one student threw a paper airplane. The Austrians decided to send Serbia an ultimatum that was designed to be rejected. It demanded things like allowing Austrian officials to participate in the investigation on Serbian soil and suppressing anti-Austrian publications, which was roughly equivalent to asking someone to punch themselves in the face while apologizing for existing. The ultimatum was so harsh that even the German Kaiser, who wasn't exactly known for his diplomatic subtlety, called it a spirited document. Serbia's response was actually quite reasonable. They accepted most of the demands, but balked at allowing Austrian officials to operate freely on Serbian territory, which was a pretty basic matter of sovereignty. But Austria-Hungary had already decided that war was the answer, regardless of what Serbia said. It was like asking someone on a date just so you could have the satisfaction of rejecting them. On July 28, 1914, exactly 1 month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. This should have been a minor regional conflict between a large empire and a small Balkan state. But thanks to the alliance system, it was like pulling the first domino in a very long and very destructive chain. Russia had positioned itself as the protector of Slavic peoples, so they felt obligated to support Serbia. This wasn't entirely altruistic. Russia wanted influence in the Balkans and saw this as an opportunity to weaken Austria-Hungary. On July 30th, Tsar Nicholas II ordered the mobilization of Russian forces, which was like announcing to the neighborhood that you were getting ready for a fight. Germany had promised to support Austria-Hungary, and they were terrified of fighting a two-front war against both Russia and France. So they had developed the Schlieffen Plan, which was basically a military strategy that assumed France would be easy to defeat quickly, allowing Germany to then focus on Russia. The plan required Germany to attack France through Belgium, which was neutral, but the German generals figured that violating Belgian neutrality was a small price to pay for avoiding a prolonged two-front war. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia, and 2 days later, they declared war on France and invaded Belgium. This brought Britain into the conflict, since they had guaranteed Belgian neutrality and couldn't allow Germany to control the Channel ports. Within a week, most of Europe was at war, all because a teenager with a pistol had gotten lucky at a street corner in Sarajevo. The German invasion of Belgium was supposed to be quick and decisive, but it immediately ran into problems. The Belgians, despite having an army that was smaller than the population of a medium-sized city, decided to actually fight back instead of politely stepping aside. The fortress city of Liege held out for 12 days, which wasn't long in absolute terms, but was long enough to disrupt the German timetable. The German army that marched through Belgium was massive. Over 1 million men in gray uniforms, looking like the world's most intimidating parade. They were convinced that they were fighting a defensive war against French and Russian aggression, while the French were equally convinced that they were defending civilization against German barbarism. Both sides were absolutely certain that God was on their side, which should have been a clue that maybe God had better things to do. The German advance through Belgium was marked by atrocities against civilians, which the Germans justified as necessary responses to franc-tireur attacks by Belgian civilians. Whether these civilian attacks actually happened or were largely imaginary is still debated by historians, but the German response was real enough. Entire towns were burned and thousands of civilians were killed. The British press had a field day with stories of German brutality, some true and some exaggerated, but all effective at convincing the British public that they were fighting against monsters. Meanwhile, the French had their own plan, called Plan 17, which was based on the revolutionary military concept of élan, basically, the idea that French soldiers were so inherently superior that they could win through sheer enthusiasm and aggressive spirit. This was roughly equivalent to believing that positive thinking could stop bullets. The French army, dressed in bright blue coats and red trousers that made them visible from space, launched attacks into Alsace-Lorraine with all the tactical sophistication of a medieval cavalry charge. The results were predictably disastrous. French casualties in the first month of the war were staggering. Over 200,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. The German machine guns cut down French infantry like wheat, and the French artillery, which was supposed to be the best in the world, proved to be less effective than advertised. The French quickly learned that élan was no match for modern firepower, but by then it was too late to change their entire military philosophy. The German advance continued through Belgium and into northern France, getting closer to Paris with each passing day. The French government packed up and moved to Bordeaux, which was the 1914 equivalent of updating your LinkedIn profile while your current job was falling apart. General Joseph Joffre, the French commander-in-chief, remained remarkably calm throughout this crisis, possibly because he had the emotional range of a particularly stoic tree. The British Expeditionary Force, all 100,000 of them, had crossed the Channel and taken up positions alongside the French. The BEF was a professional army, well-trained and well-equipped, but it was also tiny compared to the massive conscript armies of the continental powers. It was like bringing a very sharp knife to a gunfight, impressive in its own way, but not exactly what the situation called for. The first major engagement between British and German forces came at the Battle of Mons on August 23, 1914. The British, armed with rifles and trained to fire 15 rounds per minute, inflicted heavy casualties on the attacking Germans. But they were vastly outnumbered and had to retreat, beginning what became known as the Great Retreat, a fighting withdrawal that lasted for 2 weeks and covered over 200 miles. During this retreat, strange stories began to emerge. British soldiers reported seeing angels on the battlefield, helping them fight against the Germans. These angels of Mons became a powerful propaganda tool, though they were probably the result of exhaustion, stress, and the human tendency to see patterns where none exist. It's worth noting that divine intervention, if it was actually happening, seemed to have a very limited effect on the overall strategic situation. By early September, the German army was within 30 miles of Paris, and it looked like the Schlieffen Plan might actually work. But the Germans had made a crucial mistake. Instead of encircling Paris from the west, as the original plan called for, they had turned southeast to pursue the retreating French armies. This left their right flank exposed and gave the French an opportunity to counterattack. General Joffre, who had spent the previous weeks firing incompetent generals with the efficiency of a corporate downsizing, finally saw his chance. He gathered every available soldier, including the garrison of Paris, and troops rushed from the Eastern Front and prepared for a massive counterattack along the Marne River. The French even used Paris taxis to rush reinforcements to the front, which was either a stroke of logistical genius or the most expensive cab ride in history. The Battle of the Marne, fought from September 6th to 12th, 1914, was the first major Allied victory of the war. The German advance was stopped, and the German army was forced to retreat to more defensible positions along the Aisne River. The battle saved Paris and probably saved France, but it also marked the end of mobile warfare on the Western Front. From now on, the war would be fought from trenches, and those trenches would barely move for the next 4 years. The race to the sea followed, as both sides tried to outflank each other by extending their lines northward toward the English Channel. This wasn't actually a race in any meaningful sense. It was more like two very slow, very deadly conga lines trying to get around each other. By November 1914, the trench lines extended from the Swiss border to the North Sea, a distance of about 400 miles, and neither side could go around the other. The trenches that defined the Western Front weren't initially the elaborate fortifications they would later become. Early trenches were basically ditches with some sandbags. But as it became clear that this was going to be a long war, both sides began to dig deeper and build more complex defensive systems. The German trenches were generally better constructed than the Allied ones, partly because the Germans were planning to stay put, while the Allies were supposedly planning to attack and didn't want to get too comfortable. Life in the trenches was exactly as miserable as you'd expect. Soldiers lived in constant fear of sniper fire, artillery bombardment, and poison gas attacks. The trenches were infested with rats the size of cats, which fed on the corpses that littered no man's land. Lice were so common that soldiers called them cooties, and trench foot was a constant problem, caused by standing in waterlogged trenches for weeks at a time. The area between the opposing trenches, known as no man's land, was a hellscape of barbed wire, shell craters, and decomposing bodies. It could be anywhere from 50 yards to several hundred yards wide, and crossing it in daylight was usually suicide. At night, soldiers would venture out to repair wire, gather intelligence, or retrieve the wounded, always knowing that enemy snipers were watching for any movement. Artillery became the dominant weapon of the war, accounting for more casualties than any other cause. The constant bombardment was not just physically devastating, but psychologically crushing. Soldiers developed what was then called shell shock, what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. The military authorities of the time had little understanding of psychological trauma and often treated shell shock as cowardice, sometimes executing soldiers who were suffering from what we now know was a legitimate medical condition. The Christmas truce of 1914 has become one of the most famous incidents of the war, though it was probably less widespread and organized than popular culture suggests. Along various parts of the Western Front, soldiers from both sides spontaneously stopped fighting, sang Christmas carols, and in some cases even played football in no man's land. It was a brief moment of humanity in an increasingly inhuman conflict, and it terrified the military authorities on both sides, who quickly issued orders to prevent any repetition. While the Western Front was settling into its deadly stalemate, the Eastern Front was developing into a completely different kind of war. The distances were vast, the armies were more mobile, and the casualties were just as horrific, but spread over a much larger area. Russia had mobilized faster than the Germans expected, which was both good and bad news for the Allies. Good because it drew German forces away from the Western Front. Bad because the Russian army was about as well prepared for modern warfare as a medieval knight would be for a tank battle. The Russian army was massive. They could field millions of men, but it was also poorly equipped, badly led, and hampered by a logistics system that made the Pony Express look efficient. Russian soldiers often went into battle without rifles, being told to pick up weapons from their fallen comrades. This was the kind of military planning that makes you wonder if anyone in charge had actually thought about how wars work. General Alexei Brusilov, one of the few competent Russian commanders, later described the Russian army as a giant with feet of clay, which was probably being generous to clay. The Russian officer corps was dominated by aristocrats who had gotten their positions through birth rather than ability, and many of them treated the war like an extended hunting expedition with slightly higher stakes. The first major engagement on the Eastern Front was the Battle of Tannenberg in late August 1914, where two Russian armies invaded East Prussia and promptly walked into a trap that would have been obvious to anyone who had ever played chess. The German commanders, Paul von Hindenburg and Erich von Falkenhayn, used the railroad network to rapidly redeploy their forces and surround the Russian Second Army. The result was a catastrophe for Russia. An entire army was destroyed, with over 90,000 prisoners taken and casualties that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. General Alexander Samsonov, the Russian commander, was so distraught by the defeat that he walked into the forest and shot himself, which was probably the most decisive action he took during the entire campaign. The victory at Tannenberg made Hindenburg a national hero in Germany and convinced many Germans that the war in the East would be easily won. This was roughly equivalent to winning the first hand of poker and assuming you were guaranteed to win the entire game. The Russians had lost a battle, not their capacity to fight, and they had plenty more soldiers where those came from. Austria-Hungary was having its own problems on the Eastern Front. Their invasion of Serbia, which was supposed to be a quick punitive expedition, had turned into a humiliating disaster. The Serbian army, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, fought with the desperation of people defending their homeland and the tactical advantage of knowing the terrain. The Austro-Hungarian army was a multinational force that spoke 11 different languages and had about as much unit cohesion as a United Nations committee. Orders had to be translated multiple times, and soldiers often couldn't communicate with their officers. It was like trying to conduct an orchestra where half the musicians were reading different sheet music and the other half couldn't understand the conductor. The Serbian victory at the Battle of Seir in August 1914 was the first Allied victory of the war, and it sent shockwaves through the Central Powers. If tiny Serbia could defeat the mighty Austro-Hungarian Empire, what did that say about the empire's military capabilities? The answer, as it turned out, was nothing good. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire was trying to decide which side to join, if any. The Ottomans had been the sick man of Europe for decades, losing territory and influence with each passing year. The Young Turk government that had taken power in 1908 was determined to modernize the empire and restore its former glory, but they weren't sure whether that meant allying with Germany or staying neutral. The decision was made for them when two German warships, the Goeben and the Breslau, fled into Ottoman waters to escape the British Mediterranean fleet. The Ottomans purchased the ships and incorporated them into their navy, complete with German crews who simply put on Ottoman uniforms. It was like buying a used car that came with the previous owner still sitting in the driver's seat. In October 1914, these ships, now flying Ottoman flags, but still commanded by Germans, bombarded Russian ports in the Black Sea. This brought the Ottoman Empire into the war on the side of the Central Powers, opening up new fronts in the Caucasus, Mesopotamia, and the Dardanelles. The Ottomans probably thought they were joining the winning side, but they had actually just signed up for the dismantling of their empire. The entry of the Ottoman Empire into the war had global implications. It threatened British interests in Egypt and India, opened up a new front against Russia, and gave the Central Powers control of the strategic Dardanelles Strait. It also meant that the war would spread beyond Europe to the Middle East, Africa, and eventually the entire world. In Africa, the various European colonies found themselves at war with each other, which must have been confusing for the local populations, who were suddenly expected to fight for empires that had colonized them. German East Africa, under the command of Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, would conduct a brilliant guerrilla campaign that tied down hundreds of thousands of Allied troops for the entire duration of the war. The war at sea was dominated by the British Royal Navy, which imposed a blockade on Germany that would eventually prove decisive. The British had the largest navy in the world and used it to cut off German trade and starve the Central Powers of essential supplies. This was economic warfare on a scale never before seen, and it would have devastating effects on German civilian morale. Germany responded with unrestricted submarine warfare, using their U-boats to sink merchant ships bound for Allied ports. This was a new kind of warfare that violated traditional rules about warning merchant vessels before attacking them. The sinking of passenger ships like the Lusitania in May 1915, which killed over 1,000 civilians, including 128 Americans, outraged neutral opinion and began to turn American public opinion against Germany. The submarine campaign was effective militarily, but disastrous diplomatically. Germany was essentially trading short-term tactical gains for long-term strategic disaster, like winning a battle by burning down your own house. The U-boat attacks would eventually bring the United States into the war, which would prove to be the decisive factor in the Allied victory. Back on the Western Front, both sides were learning that modern defensive technology had outpaced defensive tactics. Machine guns, barbed wire, and artillery made frontal attacks suicidal, but military commanders were slow to adapt their thinking. The result was a series of massive offensives that gained little ground at enormous cost in human lives. The Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915 saw the first large-scale use of poison gas by the Germans. Chlorine gas drifted across no man's land and into the Allied trenches, causing panic and creating a gap in the line. But the Germans were as surprised by the effectiveness of their new weapon as everyone else and failed to exploit the breakthrough. It was like accidentally discovering fire and then forgetting to bring marshmallows. The use of poison gas added a new dimension of horror to an already horrific war. Soldiers now had to worry about invisible death drifting on the wind, and gas masks became as essential as rifles. The psychological effect was enormous. There's something particularly terrifying about an enemy you can't see or fight back against. The French launched their own major offensive in Champagne in the spring of 1915, convinced that they had finally figured out how to break through the German lines. They hadn't. The attack gained a few miles of worthless ground at the cost of over 100,000 casualties. General Joffre's response was essentially, "Well, that didn't work. Let's try it again," which was the kind of military thinking that made the war last 4 years instead of 4 months. The British were planning their own contribution to the offensive spirit with an attack at Gallipoli, designed to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war and open a supply route to Russia. The plan was the brainchild of Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, who was convinced that a bold stroke in the East could break the deadlock in the West. The Gallipoli campaign began with a naval attack on the Dardanelles in March 1915, but the Ottoman defenses proved stronger than expected. Several Allied battleships were sunk by mines, and the naval attack was called off. This should have been a sign that maybe the whole operation needed to be reconsidered, but instead, the Allies decided to land troops on the Gallipoli Peninsula and take the forts from the land side. The landings at Gallipoli on April 25, 1915, were a masterclass in how not to conduct an amphibious assault. The troops landed on beaches that were overlooked by Ottoman positions, under the command of a young officer named Mustafa Kemal, who would later become known as Ataturk. The Ottomans had months to prepare their defenses, and they made the most of it. The Allied forces, including British, French, Australian, and New Zealand troops, found themselves pinned down on narrow beaches under constant fire from the heights above. It was like trying to climb out of a swimming pool while someone was shooting at you from the diving board. The campaign quickly devolved into trench warfare that was even more miserable than the Western Front, if such a thing was possible. The heat, disease, and constant shelling made life at Gallipoli a special kind of hell. Dysentery was rampant, water was scarce, and the smell of decomposing bodies in the heat was overwhelming. Soldiers wrote home about flies so thick they could barely see, and about the constant presence of death in every aspect of daily life. The Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, Anzac forces at Gallipoli, became legendary for their courage and tenacity. But courage and tenacity couldn't overcome poor planning and impossible tactical situations. The Anzac landing at what became known as Anzac Cove was supposed to be a surprise attack, but the troops landed in the wrong place and found themselves facing cliffs instead of the expected gentle slopes. The campaign dragged on through the summer and into the fall of 1915, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The Allies launched several major offensives, but each one was repulsed with heavy casualties. The Ottomans, for their part, were content to hold their positions and let the Allies exhaust themselves against the Turkish defenses. By December 1915, it was clear that the Gallipoli campaign was a failure. The decision was made to evacuate the Allied forces, which was carried out with remarkable efficiency. Ironically, the evacuation was the most successful part of the entire operation. Over 250,000 Allied casualties had been suffered for no strategic gain whatsoever. The failure at Gallipoli had far-reaching consequences. It ended Churchill's career as First Lord of the Admiralty, at least temporarily. It established Turkey as a serious military power and made Mustafa Kemal a national hero. Most importantly, it demonstrated that there were no easy alternatives to the bloody stalemate on the Western Front. While the Allies were failing at Gallipoli, the Central Powers were achieving spectacular success on the Eastern Front. A combined German-Austrian offensive in the summer of 1915 drove the Russians out of Poland and inflicted over 1 million casualties. The Russian army was in full retreat, and it looked like Russia might be knocked out of the war entirely. The success on the Eastern Front convinced the Central Powers that they were winning the war, but this was a dangerous illusion. Russia was retreating, but it wasn't defeated. It was trading space for time, and it had plenty of both. The German and Austrian armies were advancing into the vast emptiness of the Russian interior, where supply lines became longer and more vulnerable with each mile. Italy had been watching the war from the sidelines, trying to decide which side offered the better deal. The Italians had been allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary before the war, but they had no love for the Austrians and saw an opportunity to gain territory at Austrian expense. In May 1915, Italy declared war on Austria-Hungary, opening yet another front in what was becoming a truly global conflict. The Italian front was characterized by some of the most difficult terrain of the entire war. The fighting took place in the Alps, where soldiers had to deal with avalanches, frostbite, and the constant danger of falling off mountains in addition to the usual hazards of combat. It was like regular warfare, but with the added challenge of trying not to plummet to your death. The Italians launched a series of offensives along the Isonzo River, each one more futile than the last. There would eventually be 11 battles of the Isonzo, which sounds impressive until you realize that they gained virtually nothing except casualties. The Italian commander, Luigi Cadorna, was a firm believer in the frontal assault, apparently convinced that if you threw enough men at a mountain, eventually the mountain would move. Back on the Western Front, the French were preparing for another massive offensive, this time at Verdun. The German commander, Erich von Falkenhayn, had decided that the key to winning the war was to bleed France white by attacking a position that the French would have to defend at all costs. Verdun was a fortress city that had symbolic importance far beyond its strategic value. It was the kind of place that nations would sacrifice everything to hold. The German attack on Verdun began on February 21, 1916, with the largest artillery bombardment in history up to that point. Over 1 million shells were fired in the first 10 hours, turning the landscape around Verdun into something that resembled the surface of the moon. The bombardment was so intense that it could be heard 100 miles away, and the ground shook like an earthquake. The Battle of Verdun would last for 10 months and become a symbol of French determination and German ruthlessness. The French commander, Philippe Pétain, organized a supply system that kept the fortress supplied via a single road that became known as the Sacred Way. Trucks ran continuously along this road, bringing supplies and reinforcements to the front and carrying out the wounded and the dead. The fighting at Verdun was characterized by a level of intensity that was extreme even by World War I standards. Villages changed hands dozens of times, and the landscape was so thoroughly destroyed that it was impossible to tell where roads had once run. Soldiers fought over piles of rubble that had once been buildings, and the dead were buried and reburied by artillery fire until the ground itself seemed to be made of human remains. The psychological impact of Verdun was enormous. French soldiers called it the mill because it ground up men like grain. The constant artillery fire drove many soldiers insane, and the casualty rates were so high that entire units would be wiped out and replaced multiple times during the course of the battle. Yet somehow, the French held on, driven by a determination that bordered on the fanatical. While the Germans were trying to bleed France white at Verdun, the British were preparing their own offensive on the Somme. The Battle of the Somme was supposed to relieve pressure on Verdun and break through the German lines once and for all. It was planned by General Douglas Haig, a man who combined supreme confidence with a complete inability to learn from experience. The British plan was simple in concept. A massive artillery bombardment would destroy the German defenses, and then the infantry would walk across no man's land and occupy the enemy trenches. The bombardment lasted for a week and used over 1.5 million shells, leading British commanders to believe that nothing could have survived such an onslaught. They were wrong. The German trenches were deeper and better constructed than the British realized, and many of the British shells were duds or too light to penetrate the German fortifications. When the bombardment lifted on the morning of July 1st, 1916, German machine gunners emerged from their bunkers to find waves of British infantry walking slowly across no man's land in neat lines, as if they were on parade. The first day of the Somme was the bloodiest day in British military history. Over 60,000 British casualties, including 20,000 dead, for gains that could be measured in yards. Entire battalions were wiped out in minutes, and the British attack failed along almost the entire front. It was a disaster of such magnitude that it's difficult to comprehend even today. The Battle of the Somme continued for 4.5 months, with the British and French gradually grinding forward at enormous cost. New tactics were developed, including the use of tanks for the first time in warfare, but the fundamental problem remained. Defensive technology was still superior to offensive tactics. The tank was a British invention, developed in secret and given the code name Tank to disguise its true purpose. Workers were told they were building water tanks for the Russian army. The first tanks were slow, unreliable, and prone to breaking down, but they represented a new approach to the problem of crossing no man's land under fire. The first use of tanks at the Battle of Flers-Courcelette in September 1916 was more of a publicity stunt than a military breakthrough. Only a few tanks actually made it to the German lines, but their psychological impact was significant. German soldiers had never seen anything like these armored monsters, and some fled in panic at the sight of them. By the time the Battle of the Somme ended in November 1916, the Allies had advanced about 6 miles at a cost of over 600,000 casualties. The Germans had lost about 500,000 men defending their positions. It was the kind of exchange rate that made you wonder if anyone in charge could actually do math. The year 1916 also saw the only major naval battle of the war, the Battle of Jutland. The German High Seas Fleet ventured out of port to challenge British naval supremacy, leading to a confused engagement in the North Sea that both sides claimed as a victory. The Germans sank more ships and inflicted more casualties, but they retreated to port and never seriously challenged British control of the seas again. The battle was typical of World War I in that it was enormously destructive but strategically inconclusive. The British maintained their naval blockade of Germany, while the Germans continued their submarine campaign against Allied shipping. It was like a boxing match where both fighters landed devastating blows, but neither one fell down, so they just kept hitting each other until they were both too exhausted to continue. The year 1917 began with both sides exhausted, but unwilling to admit defeat. The war had already lasted longer than anyone had predicted, and cost more than anyone had imagined. But the political leaders on all sides were trapped by their own rhetoric. They had told their populations that this was a war for civilization, for democracy, for the fatherland. And now they couldn't admit that maybe it was just a war for no particularly good reason that had gotten completely out of hand. Russia was in the worst shape of all the major powers. The Tsar's government was incompetent, even by the standards of incompetent governments. The economy was collapsing, and the army was falling apart. Russian soldiers were deserting in massive numbers, sometimes taking their weapons with them to join revolutionary groups. It was like watching a slow-motion train wreck, if train wrecks lasted for years and killed millions of people. The February Revolution in Russia began almost by accident. Bread riots in Petrograd turned into general strikes, which turned into mutinies by army units, which turned into the collapse of the entire Tsarist system. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule, and a provisional government took power with the promise of continuing the war effort. This was exactly what the war-weary Russian people didn't want to hear. The provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky, was committed to honoring Russia's obligations to its allies and continuing the fight against Germany. This was like promising to keep hitting yourself in the head with a hammer because you had told your friends you would do it. The Germans, meanwhile, had made one of the most consequential decisions in modern history. They decided to help Vladimir Lenin return to Russia from his exile in Switzerland. Lenin was the leader of the Bolshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Party, and he had been advocating for Russia's withdrawal from the war and the overthrow of the capitalist system. The German decision to transport Lenin across their territory in a sealed train car was like giving a loaded gun to someone who had publicly announced their intention to shoot you, but who promised to shoot your enemies first. The Germans figured that Lenin would cause chaos in Russia and force the Russians out of the war, which would allow Germany to transfer troops to the Western Front for a final offensive. Lenin arrived at the Finland station in Petrograd in April 1917 and immediately began agitating for peace, land, and bread, 3 things that the provisional government seemed incapable of providing. His April thesis called for the overthrow of the provisional government and Russia's immediate withdrawal from the war, which made him about as popular with the Russian establishment as a vegetarian at a barbecue convention. The provisional government's decision to launch one more offensive in the summer of 1917 was the final nail in their coffin. The Kerensky offensive was supposed to restore Russian morale and demonstrate that the new democratic Russia was a reliable ally. Instead, it demonstrated that the Russian army was completely demoralized and that the provisional government was as out of touch with reality as the Tsar had been. The offensive was a complete disaster. Russian units refused to attack, and when they did attack, they were easily repulsed by the Germans and Austrians. Entire divisions simply dissolved, with soldiers walking away from the front to return to their villages. It was less like a military retreat, and more like a very large, very armed group of people deciding they had better things to do. While Russia was falling apart, the United States was finally entering the war. President Woodrow Wilson had spent 2.5 years trying to keep America neutral, but German submarine attacks and the infamous Zimmermann telegram had made neutrality impossible to maintain. The Zimmermann telegram was a diplomatic communication from the German Foreign Secretary to the German ambassador in Mexico, proposing a military alliance between Germany and Mexico if the United States entered the war. The telegram was intercepted and decoded by British intelligence, who gleefully shared it with the Americans. It was the kind of diplomatic blunder that makes you wonder if the German Foreign Office was staffed entirely by people who had failed basic common sense tests. The telegram proposed that Mexico should attack the United States and in return would receive the territories of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona after Germany won the war. This was roughly equivalent to asking someone to help you rob a bank in exchange for a share of money you didn't have yet and probably would never get. American entry into the war was a game changer, but not immediately. The United States had a tiny army by European standards, about 100,000 men, compared to the millions fielded by the European powers. American industry was powerful, but it would take time to convert from peacetime to wartime production. Most importantly, it would take time to train and transport American soldiers to Europe. The Germans knew this, which is why they decided to launch one final offensive on the Western Front before American reinforcements could arrive in significant numbers. But first, they had to deal with the situation in Russia, where the Bolsheviks had seized power in the October Revolution and were negotiating a separate peace. The October Revolution was almost as chaotic as the February Revolution, but with more ideology and better organization. Lenin and the Bolsheviks stormed the Winter Palace, arrested the provisional government, and declared the establishment of a socialist state. It was like a very violent change of management, except the new management had radically different ideas about how to run the business. The Bolsheviks immediately began negotiating with Germany for a separate peace, which was exactly what the Germans had hoped for when they helped Lenin return to Russia. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed in March 1918, took Russia out of the war and freed up hundreds of thousands of German troops for transfer to the Western Front. The terms of Brest-Litovsk were harsh. Russia lost Poland, the Baltic states, Finland, and Ukraine, along with a third of its population and most of its industrial capacity. But Lenin was willing to accept these losses because he believed that world revolution was imminent and that the territorial losses would be temporary. This was like selling your house because you were convinced you were about to win the lottery. With Russia out of the war, Germany could finally concentrate all its forces on the Western Front for what they called the Kaiser's Battle, a series of offensives designed to win the war before American reinforcements could tip the balance. The German commander, Erich Ludendorff, had developed new tactics based on infiltration and surprise rather than the massive frontal assaults that had characterized earlier offensives. The German Spring Offensive began on March 21, 1918, with Operation Michael, an attack on the British lines near the Old Somme battlefield. The Germans achieved complete surprise, using new tactics that emphasized speed and flexibility over the methodical advances of previous years. German stormtroopers infiltrated through weak points in the British lines, bypassing strong points and creating chaos in the rear areas. The offensive was initially successful beyond German expectations. The British Fifth Army collapsed, and the Germans advanced further in a few days than either side had managed in years of fighting. For a moment, it looked like Germany might actually win the war after all. The German advance came within 75 miles of Paris, and the French government began making plans for another evacuation. But the German offensive had fundamental problems that became apparent as it continued. The Germans were advancing into territory that had been devastated by years of fighting, where roads and railways had been destroyed and supplies were difficult to bring forward. The German army was also suffering from the same problems that had plagued all the armies throughout the war: exhaustion, supply difficulties, and declining morale. The German soldiers who broke through the British lines found themselves in a strange situation. They had been living on short rations for months due to the British blockade, and suddenly they were overrunning British supply dumps filled with food, alcohol, and other luxuries they hadn't seen in years. Many German soldiers stopped to loot these supplies instead of continuing the advance, which was understandable from a human perspective, but disastrous from a military one. The Allies responded to the German offensive by finally doing something they should have done years earlier. They appointed a unified commander. General Ferdinand Foch was given overall command of Allied forces on the Western Front, which meant that for the first time, the British, French, and American armies would be coordinated in their response to German attacks. The Germans launched 3 more major offensives in the spring and summer of 1918, each one initially successful, but ultimately failing to achieve a decisive breakthrough. Operation Georgette targeted the British in Flanders. Operation Blucher York attacked the French along the Aisne, and Operation Gneisenau was aimed at Paris itself. Each offensive gained ground, but at enormous cost in casualties that Germany could no longer afford. By July 1918, the German army had shot its bolt. The offensives had cost over 800,000 casualties, including many of Germany's best remaining troops. The army was exhausted, supplies were running low, and American reinforcements were arriving in France at a rate of 250,000 men per month. The strategic situation had fundamentally shifted in favor of the Allies. The turning point came at the Second Battle of the Marne in July 1918, where a German offensive was not only stopped, but turned into a major Allied counterattack. For the first time since 1914, the German army was in full retreat on the Western Front. The psychological impact was enormous. If the Germans could be beaten at the Marne, they could be beaten anywhere. The Allied counteroffensive that began in August 1918 was spearheaded by the Battle of Amiens, where British, Canadian, Australian, and French forces, supported by hundreds of tanks and aircraft, smashed through German lines and advanced 8 miles in a single day. Ludendorff called August 8th the Black Day of the German Army, and he was right. It marked the beginning of the end for Germany. The American Expeditionary Force, under the command of General John J. Pershing, was finally making its presence felt. American troops fought their first major independent action at the Battle of St. Mihiel in September 1918, where they eliminated a German salient that had existed since 1914. The Americans brought fresh energy and optimism to the Allied cause, along with industrial capacity that dwarfed anything the Central Powers could match. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive, launched in September 1918, was the largest American military operation of the war. Over 1 million American soldiers participated in the attack, which was designed to cut the main German supply line and force a general German retreat. The offensive was costly. American casualties exceeded 100,000, but it achieved its strategic objectives and demonstrated that the United States was now a major military power. Meanwhile, Germany's allies were collapsing one by one. Bulgaria signed an armistice in September 1918, followed by the Ottoman Empire in October. Austria-Hungary was disintegrating as various ethnic groups declared independence and formed their own nations. The Austro-Hungarian army simply ceased to exist as soldiers, deserted to join the new national armies being formed in their homelands. The situation in Germany itself was becoming desperate. The British naval blockade had reduced the German population to near starvation, with turnips becoming a dietary staple because potatoes were no longer available. Industrial production was declining due to shortages of raw materials, and civilian morale was collapsing as it became clear that the war was lost. The German Navy, which had spent most of the war safely in port, chose this moment to plan a final, suicidal sortie against the British fleet. The sailors at Kiel mutinied rather than participate in what they saw as a pointless sacrifice, and the mutiny quickly spread to other naval bases and then to the civilian population. It was like the crew of the Titanic deciding to mutiny just as the ship was sinking. Kaiser Wilhelm II, who had started the war as the supreme warlord of Germany, found himself increasingly irrelevant as military and civilian leaders took control of the situation. The Kaiser had always been better at making dramatic speeches than at making difficult decisions, and now that difficult decisions were all that remained, he was essentially sidelined by his own government. On November 9, 1918, the Kaiser abdicated and fled to the Netherlands, ending the German Empire and leaving the country in the hands of a provisional government led by the Social Democrats. It was an ignominious end for a man who had once dreamed of German world domination and had instead presided over the destruction of his own empire. The German delegation that met with Allied representatives in a railway car in the forest of Compiègne was led by Matthias Erzberger, a civilian politician who had the thankless task of signing an armistice that everyone knew was really a surrender. The terms were harsh. Germany had to evacuate all occupied territory, surrender most of its weapons and equipment, and accept Allied occupation of the Rhineland. At 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918, the guns finally fell silent on the Western Front. After 4 years, 3 months, and 2 weeks of fighting, the war to end all wars was over. The silence was reportedly so profound that many soldiers found it more unsettling than the constant noise of battle they had grown accustomed to. The human cost of the war was staggering. Military casualties totaled over 37 million, with more than 16 million dead. Civilian casualties were harder to calculate, but certainly numbered in the millions. Entire generations of young men had been wiped out, leaving behind what the French called the hollow years, a demographic gap that would affect European society for decades. The economic cost was equally devastating. The major European powers had spent the equivalent of trillions of dollars in today's money, bankrupting themselves in the process. Britain, which had entered the war as the world's largest creditor nation, emerged as a debtor. Germany was saddled with reparations that would cripple its economy for years to come. The political consequences were even more far-reaching. 4 empires had collapsed. The German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman empires were all gone, replaced by new nations that often had little experience with self-government. The map of Europe was redrawn, creating new countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, while others like Hungary and Turkey were reduced to shadows of their former selves. The Russian Revolution had brought the Bolsheviks to power, creating the world's first communist state and setting the stage for decades of ideological conflict. The war had also accelerated social changes that might otherwise have taken generations. Women had entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Class distinctions had been blurred by shared sacrifice, and traditional authorities had been discredited by their failure to prevent or quickly end the catastrophe. The United States emerged from the war as a major world power, but American public opinion quickly turned isolationist. President Wilson's dream of a League of Nations that would prevent future wars was undermined by the U.S. Senate's refusal to ratify American membership. It was like designing a fire department and then refusing to provide it with water. The peace negotiations that began in Paris in 1919 were dominated by the Big Four: Wilson of the United States, Lloyd George of Britain, Clemenceau of France, and Orlando of Italy. Each had different goals and different ideas about how to create a lasting peace, which made agreement difficult and compromise inevitable. Wilson wanted a peace without victory based on his 14 points, which emphasized self-determination, free trade, and international cooperation. Clemenceau wanted to ensure that Germany could never again threaten France, which meant keeping Germany weak and divided. Lloyd George wanted to restore the balance of power in Europe while protecting British imperial interests. Orlando wanted territorial gains for Italy that had been promised in secret treaties. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was a compromise that satisfied no one completely. Germany lost territory to France, Belgium, Denmark, and the newly created Poland, along with all its overseas colonies. The German army was limited to 100,000 men, and Germany was forbidden to have tanks, military aircraft, or submarines. The most controversial provision was Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, which placed full responsibility for the war on Germany and its allies. This was coupled with massive reparations payments that were designed to compensate the Allies for the cost of the war. The exact amount wasn't specified in the treaty, but it was eventually set at 132 billion gold marks, roughly equivalent to $400 billion in today's money. The German delegation was not allowed to participate in the negotiations and was simply presented with the finished treaty on a take-it-or-leave-it basis. The German representative, Hermann Müller, signed the treaty under protest, calling it a diktat imposed by the victors. This sense of injustice would poison German politics for the next 2 decades and provide fertile ground for extremist movements. The other Central Powers received their own treaties. Austria was reduced to a small, landlocked country and forbidden to unite with Germany. Hungary lost 2/3 of its territory and population. The Ottoman Empire was dismembered, with its Arab territories divided between Britain and France as League of Nations mandates, while Turkey itself was reduced to Anatolia and a small portion of Europe. The new nations created by the peace settlement faced enormous challenges. Poland had to integrate territories that had been under German, Austrian, and Russian rule for over a century. Czechoslovakia was an artificial creation that included Germans, Czechs, Slovaks, and other minorities who had little in common except their former subjection to Austria-Hungary. Yugoslavia was an even more complex mixture of Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, and others with different religions, alphabets, and historical experiences. The League of Nations, Wilson's pet project, was established with great fanfare but limited power. It had no army of its own and depended on member nations to enforce its decisions, which was like creating a police force that had to ask criminals nicely to arrest themselves. The absence of the United States, Germany, and the Soviet Union from the original membership further weakened its effectiveness. The immediate aftermath of the war was marked by continued violence and instability. The Russian Civil War raged until 1921, with the Bolsheviks fighting against a coalition of white Russian forces, foreign interventionists, and various nationalist movements. The Civil War was even more brutal than the World War had been, with both sides committing atrocities that made the trenches of the Western Front look civilized by comparison. The Allied intervention in the Russian Civil War was a half-hearted affair that satisfied no one and accomplished nothing except to poison relations between the two, Soviet Union and the Western powers, for decades to come. British, French, American, and Japanese forces landed at various points around the Russian periphery, ostensibly to support the white forces, but actually just to make sure that whoever won the Civil War would hate them. Germany itself was racked by revolutionary violence as various left-wing groups attempted to follow the Russian example. The Spartacist uprising in Berlin was crushed by right-wing paramilitary groups called the Freikorps, who were composed largely of demobilized soldiers who couldn't adjust to civilian life and preferred shooting people to finding regular jobs. The murder of communist leaders Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht by Freikorps members set the tone for the violent politics that would characterize the Weimar Republic. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 to 1919 killed more people than the war itself, with estimates ranging from 50 to 100 million deaths worldwide. The pandemic was particularly cruel because it disproportionately affected healthy young adults, exactly the demographic that had already been decimated by 4 years of warfare. It was as if nature had decided that the war hadn't killed enough people and wanted to finish the job. The flu was called Spanish, not because it originated in Spain, but because Spain was neutral during the war, and its press was free to report on the pandemic, while the warring nations censored news about the disease to maintain morale. This was typical of the war's legacy. Even a global health crisis was filtered through the lens of wartime propaganda and national rivalry. The economic disruption caused by the war led to hyperinflation in Germany and other defeated nations. German currency became so worthless that people needed wheelbarrows full of money to buy bread, and children played with stacks of banknotes because they were cheaper than toys. The middle class was wiped out, their savings rendered worthless overnight, creating a sense of grievance that would later be exploited by extremist political movements. The war had also fundamentally changed the nature of warfare itself. The development of aircraft, tanks, poison gas, and other new weapons had made future conflicts potentially even more destructive. The war had shown that modern industrial nations could sustain enormous casualties for years without collapsing, which was both impressive and terrifying. The psychological impact of the war on the survivors was profound and lasting. Shell shock, as it was then called, affected hundreds of thousands of veterans who returned home unable to readjust to civilian life. Many suffered from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, but the medical understanding of psychological trauma was primitive, and many veterans received little or no help. The lost generation of writers and artists who had experienced the war produced some of the most powerful literature and art of the 20th century, but their work was marked by disillusionment, cynicism, and a sense that the old certainties had been destroyed forever. The war had shattered faith in progress, civilization, and human nature itself. Women's roles had been permanently changed by the war. Millions of women had entered the workforce to replace men who were fighting, and they had proven that they could do jobs previously considered suitable only for men. The war accelerated the women's suffrage movement, with many countries granting women the vote in recognition of their wartime contributions. The war had also accelerated the decline of European colonialism, though this wouldn't become fully apparent for several decades. The colonial empires had been forced to rely heavily on troops and resources from their colonies, and colonial peoples had gained new awareness of their own importance and capabilities. The principle of self-determination proclaimed by Wilson, though applied selectively, had planted seeds that would eventually grow into independence movements across Africa and Asia. The mandate system established by the League of Nations was supposed to prepare former German and Ottoman territories for eventual independence, but in practice, it was often just colonialism under a different name. The British and French divided up the Middle East according to their own interests, creating artificial boundaries that ignored ethnic and religious divisions and would cause problems for generations to come. The war had demonstrated the importance of industrial capacity and technological innovation in modern warfare. The side with better production capabilities, more advanced weapons, and superior logistics had ultimately prevailed. This lesson would not be lost on future military planners, who would place even greater emphasis on industrial mobilization and technological development. The role of propaganda had also been crucial to the war effort. All the major powers had developed sophisticated propaganda machines to maintain civilian morale and demonize the enemy. The war had shown that public opinion was a weapon that could be as important as guns and artillery, and future conflicts would place even greater emphasis on the battle for hearts and minds. The financial cost of the war had been so enormous that it fundamentally altered the global economic system. Britain had been forced to sell off many of its overseas investments to pay for the war, while the United States had emerged as the world's largest creditor nation. The war had accelerated America's rise to global economic dominance and marked the beginning of Britain's decline as a world power. The reparations imposed on Germany created a cycle of debt and resentment that would poison international relations for years to come. Germany borrowed money from American banks to pay reparations to Britain and France, who used the money to pay their war debts to the United States. When the American economy collapsed in 1929, this circular flow of payments broke down, contributing to the global depression that followed. The peace settlement had created as many problems as it solved. The new nations of Eastern Europe were economically weak and politically unstable, with large ethnic minorities who felt oppressed by the majority populations. The principle of self-determination had been applied inconsistently, creating grievances that would be exploited by future aggressors. The war had also failed to resolve the fundamental tensions that had caused it in the first place. Nationalism remained a powerful force. Militarism had been temporarily discredited, but not eliminated, and the alliance system had been replaced by new arrangements that were equally fragile. The League of Nations was supposed to provide collective security, but it lacked the power to enforce its decisions against determined aggressors. Perhaps most importantly, the war had created a generation of leaders who had learned the wrong lessons from the conflict. Many concluded that the war had been caused by insufficient preparation, and that the solution was to build even larger armies and more powerful weapons. Others believed that the war had been caused by the alliance system and that the solution was isolation and neutrality. The veterans who returned home found a world that had changed beyond recognition. The old social hierarchies had been shaken, traditional values had been questioned, and the certainties of the pre-war world had been shattered. Many veterans felt alienated from civilian society and struggled to find meaning in a world that seemed to have learned nothing from their sacrifice. The war memorials that sprang up in every town and village across Europe served as constant reminders of the enormous cost of the conflict. The names carved in stone represented not just individual tragedies, but the destruction of an entire way of life. The memorials promised that the dead had not died in vain, but many people wondered what exactly had been accomplished by their sacrifice. The war to end all wars had instead created conditions that made future wars more likely. The harsh peace settlement had created resentment among the defeated powers. The new nations were weak and unstable, and the global economic system had been fundamentally disrupted. The war had solved none of the underlying problems that had caused it, and had created many new ones. The technology developed during the war would continue to evolve, making future conflicts even more destructive. Aircraft would become faster and more capable, tanks would become more powerful and reliable, and new weapons like rockets and eventually nuclear bombs would make the artillery barrages of World War I seem almost quaint by comparison. The war had also demonstrated the importance of intelligence and code-breaking in modern warfare. The interception of the Zimmermann telegram had helped bring the United States into the war, while the breaking of German codes had given the Allies crucial advantages in naval warfare. Future conflicts would place even greater emphasis on intelligence gathering and information warfare. The medical advances made during the war, driven by the need to treat unprecedented numbers of casualties, would have lasting benefits for civilian medicine. Techniques for treating trauma, performing surgery under difficult conditions, and dealing with infectious diseases were all advanced by the wartime experience. The war had been a laboratory for medical innovation, though the cost in human suffering had been enormous. The war had also accelerated social changes that might otherwise have taken decades to occur. Class distinctions had been blurred by shared sacrifice. Traditional authorities had been discredited by their failure to prevent or quickly end the war, and new ideas about democracy, socialism, and nationalism had gained currency. The old world of kings and emperors had largely disappeared, replaced by republics and nation-states. The environmental impact of the war was also significant, though it wouldn't be fully understood for decades. The Western Front had been turned into a moonscape of shell craters and poisoned soil, while the massive consumption of resources had accelerated deforestation and industrial pollution. The war had shown that human beings could alter their environment on a scale previously unimaginable. The war had created a new international system based on the principle of national self-determination, but this principle proved to be more complicated in practice than in theory. Many of the new nations contained significant ethnic minorities, and the borders drawn by the peacemakers often ignored economic and geographic realities. The result was a patchwork of weak states that would prove vulnerable to future aggression. The failure of the United States to join the League of Nations was a crucial blow to the new international order. Without American participation, the League lacked the power to enforce its decisions against major powers, and it gradually became irrelevant as a force for peace. The American retreat into isolationism left Britain and France to maintain the peace settlement without adequate resources or support. The war had also created new forms of international cooperation, including the International Labor Organization and various technical agencies that would eventually become part of the United Nations system. These organizations represented a recognition that many problems required international solutions, even if the political will to implement such solutions was often lacking. The cultural impact of the war was equally profound. The optimism and confidence of the pre-war era had been replaced by cynicism and doubt. The idea of progress, which had been central to 19th century thought, had been shattered by the demonstration that technological advancement could lead to unprecedented destruction rather than human betterment. The war had also changed the relationship between government and society. The total mobilization required by modern warfare had given governments unprecedented power over their citizens' lives, and many of these powers were retained after the war ended. The war had shown that democratic governments could be just as ruthless and controlling as authoritarian ones when they felt their survival was at stake. The religious impact of the war was also significant. Many people lost their faith in a benevolent God who would allow such suffering, while others found their faith strengthened by the experience of surviving the conflict. The war had raised fundamental questions about the nature of good and evil, the meaning of sacrifice, and the purpose of human existence. The war had created a new vocabulary of horror: shell shock, no man's land, going over the top, the big push, that would enter common usage and shape how people thought about conflict and suffering. The war had also created new rituals of remembrance, including the 2-minute silence and the wearing of poppies, that would become permanent features of national life. The economic consequences of the war would continue to reverberate for decades. The destruction of productive capacity, the destruction of trade patterns, and the burden of war debts would contribute to economic instability. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, war had shown that modern economies were more fragile and interconnected than previously understood. The war had also demonstrated the importance of morale and public opinion in sustaining a war effort. The side that could maintain civilian support and military discipline longest would ultimately prevail, regardless of initial advantages in manpower or resources. This lesson would be applied in future conflicts, with even greater emphasis placed on propaganda and psychological warfare. The technological legacy of the war would continue to shape military thinking for decades to come. The development of aircraft, tanks, submarines, and chemical weapons had fundamentally altered the nature of warfare, making future conflicts potentially even more destructive. The war had shown that technological innovation could provide decisive advantages, leading to an arms race that would continue throughout the 20th century. The war had also created new forms of international law, including attempts to regulate the conduct of warfare and protect civilian populations. The Geneva Conventions and other international agreements represented efforts to impose some limits on the brutality of modern warfare, though their effectiveness would prove limited when nations felt their survival was at stake. The demographic impact of the war would affect European society for generations. The loss of so many young men had created a gender imbalance that would persist for decades, while the decline in birth rates during the war years had created a demographic gap that would affect economic and social development. The war had literally changed the composition of European society. The war had also accelerated the development of new forms of communication and transportation. The need to coordinate military operations over vast distances had spurred innovations in radio, telephone, and aviation technology that would have civilian applications in the post-war world. The war had been a catalyst for technological development across many fields. The psychological trauma inflicted by the war would affect not just the veterans who had fought in it, but their families and communities for generations to come. The war had created a culture of mourning and remembrance that would shape European society throughout the 20th century. The dead were not forgotten, but their memory became a burden as much as an inspiration. The war had shown that modern industrial societies could sustain enormous losses without collapsing, but it had also shown that such losses came at a terrible cost in human suffering and social disruption. The war had tested the limits of human endurance and found that those limits were higher than anyone had imagined. But reaching them had required sacrifices that called into question whether the goals achieved were worth the price paid. In the end, World War I had been a catastrophe that solved nothing and created the conditions for even greater catastrophes to come. The war that was supposed to end all wars had instead shown that human beings were capable of inflicting unprecedented suffering on each other, and that the technologies of destruction would continue to advance faster than the institutions designed to control them. The Great War, as it came to be known, had been great only in its capacity for destruction, and its legacy would haunt the world for decades to come. The immediate post-war period was characterized by what historians would later call the crisis of democracy, though at the time it probably felt more like the crisis of everything. The old certainties had been blown apart along with the trenches, and nobody seemed quite sure what was supposed to replace them. It was like renovating a house by setting off dynamite in the basement and then wondering why the whole structure was unstable. The demobilization of millions of soldiers created massive social and economic problems that governments were ill-equipped to handle. These men had spent years learning how to kill efficiently, and now they were expected to return to civilian jobs that often no longer existed. Many veterans found that their old employers had either gone out of business or replaced them with women or older men who had stayed home during the war. It was like coming back from a very long, very traumatic business trip to find that your company had been sold and your desk given to someone else. The Red Scare that swept through many countries in the immediate aftermath of the war was partly a reaction to the Russian Revolution, but it was also a response to the very real social tensions created by demobilization and economic disruption. Governments that had spent 4 years telling their populations that sacrifice was necessary for victory now had to explain why victory seemed to involve unemployment, inflation, and social unrest. In Germany, the situation was particularly volatile. The new Weimar Republic was saddled with the burden of signing the armistice and accepting the Treaty of Versailles, which made it easy for right-wing politicians to claim that the Republic was illegitimate and that Germany had been stabbed in the back by politicians and minorities rather than defeated on the battlefield. This was roughly equivalent to blaming the referee for your team's loss in a game where you were outscored 50-3. The stab in the back myth was particularly pernicious because it allowed Germans to avoid confronting the reality of their military defeat. Instead of acknowledging that their armies had been beaten in the field, they could blame their problems on a conspiracy of socialists, Democrats, and Jews who had supposedly undermined the war effort from within. It was the kind of explanation that felt emotionally satisfying while being factually nonsensical. The hyperinflation that struck Germany in the early 1920s was partly a result of the government's decision to finance the war through borrowing rather than taxation, and partly a result of the reparations payments imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. The German government essentially printed money to pay its bills, which worked about as well as you'd expect. By 1923, it took 4.2 trillion marks to buy a single US dollar, which made German currency less valuable than the paper it was printed on. The social consequences of hyperinflation were devastating. The middle class, which had been the backbone of German society, saw their savings wiped out overnight. People who had worked their entire lives to build up modest nest eggs found themselves destitute, while speculators and those with access to foreign currency became wealthy. It was like a giant lottery where the prizes went to the least deserving people and everyone else got nothing. The French occupation of the Ruhr Valley in 1923, in response to German defaults on reparations payments, further destabilized the situation. The German government called for passive resistance, which meant that German workers were paid to not work while French and Belgian troops tried to extract coal and steel from mines and factories operated by hostile workers. It was like trying to run a business where all your employees had been instructed to sabotage everything while still collecting their paychecks. The Munich Beer Hall Putsch of November 1923 was an early indication of the kind of extremist movements that were emerging from the chaos of the post-war period. Adolf Hitler, a failed artist turned political agitator, attempted to overthrow the Bavarian government with the help of some disgruntled war veterans and right-wing politicians. The putsch failed miserably, with Hitler fleeing the scene when police opened fire, but it gave him a platform to spread his message of nationalism, anti-Semitism, and resentment. Meanwhile, in Italy, Benito Mussolini had already successfully exploited post-war chaos to seize power. Mussolini, a former socialist who had reinvented himself as a nationalist, used a combination of violence, political maneuvering, and theatrical gestures to convince the Italian establishment that he was the only alternative to communist revolution. His march on Rome in 1922 was more of a train ride to Rome followed by a photo opportunity, but it was effective political theater. The rise of fascism in Italy was facilitated by the weakness of liberal democratic institutions and the fear of communist revolution. Italian liberals thought they could use Mussolini to destroy the left and then discard him when he was no longer useful, which was roughly equivalent to thinking you could tame a wild animal by feeding it your neighbors and expecting it not to eventually eat you too. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, was struggling to rebuild after the devastation of World War, civil war, and foreign intervention. Lenin's new economic policy represented a temporary retreat from pure socialism, allowing some private enterprise and market mechanisms to help restore the economy. It was like a communist government admitting that maybe capitalism wasn't entirely evil, at least when it came to getting food to people who were starving. The death of Lenin in 1924 led to a power struggle within the Communist Party that would eventually be won by Joseph Stalin, a Georgian revolutionary who had spent the war years in various administrative positions rather than leading armies or making speeches. Stalin's rise to power was facilitated by his control of the party apparatus and his ability to outmaneuver more charismatic rivals like Leon Trotsky. It was like the office manager gradually taking over the company while the executives were fighting over who got the corner office. The stabilization of European currencies in the mid-1920s, largely through American loans and investment, created a brief period of prosperity that became known as the Golden Twenties. This was particularly pronounced in Germany, where American capital helped rebuild industry and restore economic growth. For a few years, it seemed like the problems created by the war might actually be solved through economic prosperity and international cooperation. The Locarno Treaties of 1925 represented an attempt to create a new basis for European security based on voluntary agreements rather than the imposed settlement of Versailles. Germany agreed to accept its western borders with France and Belgium, while France agreed to guarantee Germany's security against unprovoked attack. It was like a group of people who had been fighting agreeing to shake hands and promise to be nice to each other, which worked about as well as such agreements usually do. The admission of Germany to the League of Nations in 1926 was seen as a sign that the country was being reintegrated into the international community. Gustav Stresemann, the German foreign minister, pursued a policy of fulfillment, accepting the terms of Versailles while working to modify them through negotiation rather than confrontation. It was a reasonable approach that might have worked if everyone involved had been reasonable people. The Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, which renounced war as an instrument of national policy, was signed by virtually every nation in the world and was about as effective as a chocolate teapot. The pact had no enforcement mechanism and was full of loopholes that allowed countries to claim they were acting in self-defense, even when they were clearly the aggressors. It was the kind of international agreement that made everyone feel good while accomplishing absolutely nothing. The cultural flowering of the 1920s was partly a reaction to the trauma of the war, and partly a result of the prosperity that American investment had brought to Europe. The lost generation of writers and artists produced works that captured the disillusionment and cynicism of the post-war period, while also celebrating the freedom and experimentation that seemed possible in the new world that was emerging from the ruins of the old. Jazz music, which had originated in the United States, became a symbol of modernity and rebellion against traditional values. The fact that jazz was associated with African Americans made it even more scandalous to conservative Europeans, who saw it as evidence of cultural decay and racial mixing. It was like rock and roll would be in the 1950s, except with more brass instruments and fewer electric guitars. The changing role of women in post-war society was symbolized by the flapper, young women who wore short skirts, cut their hair short, smoked cigarettes, and generally behaved in ways that would have scandalized their mothers. The war had given women new opportunities and new confidence, and many were reluctant to return to the restrictive roles they had occupied before 1914. The development of new technologies like radio, cinema, and automobiles was transforming daily life in ways that would have been unimaginable before the war. Mass production techniques, many of which had been developed for military purposes, were now being applied to consumer goods, making luxuries available to ordinary people for the first time. The automobile industry, in particular, was revolutionizing transportation and social relationships. Henry Ford's assembly line methods had made cars affordable for middle-class families, and the freedom of movement that automobiles provided was changing everything from courtship patterns to urban planning. It was like the internet would be in the 1990s, except with more pollution and traffic accidents. The stock market boom of the late 1920s created an atmosphere of speculation and easy money that seemed to validate the optimism of the era. Everyone seemed to be getting rich by buying stocks, and those who weren't buying stocks were being told they were missing out on the opportunity of a lifetime. It was the kind of financial bubble that always ends badly, but never seems like a bubble to the people living through it. The crash of October 1929 brought the party to an abrupt end. The collapse of stock prices wiped out billions of dollars in paper wealth and triggered a global economic depression that would last for most of the 1930s. The crash was particularly devastating because it revealed that the prosperity of the 1920s had been built on a foundation of debt and speculation rather than genuine economic growth. The Great Depression hit Germany particularly hard because the German economy had become dependent on American loans and investment. When American capital was withdrawn to deal with problems at home, German businesses collapsed, unemployment soared, and the political extremes began to gain support from desperate people looking for someone to blame for their problems. The rise of the Nazi Party in Germany was facilitated by the economic crisis, but it was also a direct consequence of the unresolved tensions left over from World War I. Hitler's message of national renewal, revenge against Germany's enemies, and restoration of German greatness resonated with people who felt humiliated by defeat and betrayed by their own government. The failure of democratic governments to deal effectively with the economic crisis discredited liberal democracy in the eyes of many Europeans. If democracy couldn't provide jobs and prosperity, then maybe it was time to try something else. The fact that the Soviet Union seemed to be immune to the Depression made communism attractive to some, while others were drawn to fascism's promise of national revival and strong leadership. The Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931 was the first major challenge to the post-war international order, and the League of Nations' ineffective response demonstrated the weakness of the collective security system. Japan simply ignored the League's condemnation and withdrew from the organization, showing that determined aggressors could act with impunity as long as they were willing to accept international disapproval. The rise of militarism in Japan was partly a response to the economic crisis, but it was also driven by a belief that Japan needed to expand its territory and resources to compete with the Western powers. The Japanese military, which had gained enormous prestige from victories over China and Russia before World War, increasingly dominated Japanese politics and pushed for aggressive expansion in Asia. Hitler's rise to power in Germany in 1933 marked the beginning of the end for the post-war settlement. The Nazi regime immediately began rearming Germany in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, while also implementing domestic policies that targeted Jews, political opponents, and other groups deemed undesirable by the regime. The international response to Hitler's early moves was characterized by appeasement, the belief that his demands could be satisfied through negotiation and compromise. This policy was based on the reasonable desire to avoid another world war, but it failed to recognize that Hitler's goals were unlimited and that compromise would only encourage further aggression. The remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936 was Hitler's first major gamble, and its success convinced him that the Western democracies lacked the will to resist German expansion. The French and British governments protested, but took no action, partly because they were still traumatized by the memory of World War I, and partly because they hoped that Hitler could be contained through diplomatic means. The Spanish Civil War, which began in 1936, became a dress rehearsal for World War II, as Germany and Italy supported the fascist rebels, while the Soviet Union aided the Republican government. The war demonstrated the effectiveness of new military technologies, like dive bombers and tanks, while also showing that the Western democracies were reluctant to intervene in conflicts that might lead to a wider war. The Anschluss with Austria in 1938 was Hitler's next major success, and it was achieved without firing a shot. The Austrian government, faced with internal Nazi pressure and the threat of German invasion, simply capitulated and invited German troops to occupy the country. It was like being mugged by someone who convinced you to hand over your wallet voluntarily. The Munich crisis of 1938, triggered by Hitler's demands for the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia, brought Europe to the brink of war before British Prime Minister Neville. Chamberlain negotiated a settlement that gave Hitler everything he wanted in exchange for a promise of peace. Chamberlain returned to London claiming to have achieved peace for our time, which turned out to be about as accurate as a weather forecast made by someone who had never been outside. The dismemberment of Czechoslovakia in March 1939 finally convinced the Western powers that Hitler could not be appeased. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Britain and France declared war, beginning World War II exactly 20 years after the end of the war that was supposed to end all wars. The failure of the post-World War I settlement was not inevitable, but it was made more likely by the contradictions and compromises built into the peace treaties. The attempt to create a new international order based on national self-determination and collective security was undermined by the continued existence of the balance of power system and the unwillingness of the major powers to subordinate their national interests to international law. The economic instability of the interwar period, caused partly by the disruption of trade patterns and financial systems during World War I, created conditions that favored extremist political movements. The Great Depression, in particular, discredited liberal democracy and capitalism in the eyes of many people who were looking for alternatives to a system that seemed to have failed them. The psychological trauma of World War I also played a role in the failure of the peace settlement. The generation that had fought in the trenches was determined to avoid another such catastrophe, but their horror of war made them reluctant to use force to maintain the peace. This created a situation where aggressors could act with impunity as long as they were careful not to provoke a general war. The technological developments that had emerged from World War I continued to evolve during the interwar period, making future conflicts potentially even more destructive. The development of aircraft, in particular, meant that civilian populations would be vulnerable to attack in ways that had been impossible during the previous war. The ideological conflicts that emerged from the Russian Revolution and the rise of fascism created new sources of international tension that cut across traditional national boundaries. The struggle between democracy, communism, and fascism would dominate international relations for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. The colonial empires that had been expanded as a result of World War I were already showing signs of strain by the 1930s. The principle of self-determination that had been applied to Europe was beginning to be demanded by colonial peoples who had contributed to the war effort and expected to be rewarded with greater autonomy or independence. The failure of the United States to take on the international responsibilities that its economic and military power implied was a crucial factor in the breakdown of the post-war order. American isolationism left Britain and France to maintain a settlement that they lacked the resources to enforce, while also depriving the League of Nations of the support it needed to be effective. The arms limitation agreements of the 1920s and early 1930s were well-intentioned, but ultimately ineffective, because they failed to address the underlying political tensions that drove the arms race. Limiting the number of battleships was meaningless if countries were developing new weapons like aircraft and tanks that weren't covered by the agreements. The cultural and intellectual impact of World War I continued to influence European thought throughout the interwar period. The disillusionment with traditional values and institutions that had emerged from the war created a climate of experimentation and rebellion that was reflected in art, literature, philosophy, and politics. The demographic impact of World War I had long-term consequences that extended far beyond the immediate post-war period. The loss of so many young men had created a generation gap that affected everything from political leadership to cultural development. The countries that had suffered the heaviest casualties were also those that would prove most vulnerable to extremist movements in the 1930s. The environmental damage caused by World War I, particularly on the Western Front, was still visible decades after the war ended. The battlefields of Verdun and the Somme remained scarred landscapes where nothing would grow, serving as permanent reminders of the war's destructive power. The medical advances that had been made during World War I continued to benefit civilian populations throughout the interwar period. Techniques for treating trauma, performing surgery, and dealing with infectious diseases that had been developed in military hospitals were adapted for civilian use, improving healthcare for millions of people. The organizational innovations that had emerged from the need to coordinate massive military operations were also applied to civilian purposes. The techniques of mass production, logistics, and administration that had been developed for military purposes were used to create more efficient businesses and government agencies. The financial innovations that had been developed to fund the war effort, including new forms of taxation and government borrowing, became permanent features of modern states. The war had demonstrated that governments could mobilize enormous resources when necessary, and this lesson would be applied to peacetime challenges like economic development and social welfare. The propaganda techniques that had been developed during World War I were refined and perfected during the interwar period, becoming powerful tools for political manipulation and social control. The war had shown that public opinion could be shaped and directed through carefully crafted messages, and this knowledge was eagerly adopted by politicians, advertisers, and ideological movements of all stripes. The concept of total war that had emerged during World War I became the template for future conflicts. The idea that entire societies, not just armies, were legitimate targets had fundamentally changed the nature of warfare. This meant that future wars would be even more destructive to civilian populations, as the distinction between combatants and non-combatants became increasingly blurred. The international law that had been developed in response to World War I, including the Geneva Conventions and various treaties governing the conduct of warfare, represented genuine attempts to impose some limits on the brutality of modern conflict. However, these agreements were only as strong as the willingness of nations to abide by them, and they proved inadequate when faced with regimes that rejected the entire concept of international law. The veterans' organizations that emerged after World War I became powerful political forces in many countries. These groups, which included organizations like the American Legion and the British Legion, wielded considerable influence over government policy and helped shape public memory of the war. However, veterans' organizations in defeated countries often became breeding grounds for extremists, movements that promised to restore national honor and reverse the verdict of 1918. The war memorials and cemeteries that were constructed throughout the 1920s and 1930s served multiple purposes beyond simply honoring the dead. They were also political statements about the meaning of the war and the values for which the soldiers had supposedly died. The design and location of these memorials often reflected contemporary political tensions and competing interpretations of the war's significance. The cult of the fallen soldier that developed in many countries during the interwar period had profound political implications. The idealization of those who had died in the war created a standard of sacrifice that living politicians found difficult to match, while also providing a powerful symbol that could be manipulated for political purposes. The dead could not speak for themselves, which made it easy for others to claim to speak for them. The economic theories that emerged from attempts to understand the causes and consequences of World War I would influence government policy for decades to come. John Maynard Keynes's critique of the Treaty of Versailles in the economic consequences of the peace helped establish his reputation as one of the world's leading economists, while his later work on government intervention in the economy was partly inspired by the lessons of wartime economic mobilization. The development of new forms of international cooperation during the interwar period, including technical organizations and professional associations, represented attempts to create functional alternatives to the failed political institutions of the League of Nations. These organizations often proved more durable and effective than their political counterparts because they focused on practical problems rather than ideological conflicts. The rise of mass media during the interwar period was partly a consequence of technologies that had been developed or refined during World War I radio broadcasting. In particular, became a powerful tool for political communication and propaganda. The ability of political leaders to speak directly to millions of people simultaneously had profound implications for democratic politics and authoritarian control alike. The aviation industry that emerged from World War I transformed not only military affairs, but also civilian transportation and communication. The development of commercial aviation made the world smaller and more interconnected, while also making it more vulnerable to attack. The same aircraft that could carry passengers and mail could also carry bombs, blurring the distinction between civilian and military technology. The chemical industry that had been expanded during World War I to produce explosives and poison gas found new peacetime applications in agriculture, medicine, and manufacturing. However, the knowledge and infrastructure that had been developed for military purposes could easily be converted back to weapons production, creating a permanent potential for chemical warfare that would haunt international relations for decades to come. The psychological understanding of human behavior that had been advanced by the need to treat shell shock and maintain military morale was applied to civilian purposes during the interwar period. The emerging fields of psychology and psychiatry were influenced by wartime experiences, while the techniques of mass persuasion that had been developed for military propaganda were adapted for commercial advertising and political campaigning. The social changes that had been accelerated by World War I continued to work their way through European and American society during the interwar period. The breakdown of traditional class distinctions, the changing role of women, and the questioning of established authorities all had their roots in the wartime experience. These changes created opportunities for social progress, but also generated backlash from those who wanted to restore the old order. The religious and philosophical responses to World War I continued to evolve throughout the interwar period. Some people found their faith strengthened by the experience of surviving the war, while others lost their belief in a benevolent deity who would allow such suffering. The war had raised fundamental questions about the nature of good and evil, the meaning of sacrifice, and the purpose of human existence that could not be easily answered. The artistic and literary movements that emerged from World War I continued to influence cultural development throughout the interwar period. Dadaism, Surrealism, and other avant-garde movements were partly responses to the irrationality and destructiveness of the war, while the lost generation of writers continued to explore themes of disillusionment and alienation that had their roots in the wartime experience. The educational systems of the major powers were reformed during the interwar period, partly in response to the lessons of World War I. There was a recognition that future conflicts would require not just military training, but also technical education and scientific research. The war had demonstrated the importance of industrial capacity and technological innovation, leading to greater emphasis on science and engineering education. The urban planning and architecture of the interwar period were also influenced by the experience of World War I. The destruction of cities like Ypres and Verdun had demonstrated the vulnerability of traditional urban centers, leading to new approaches to city design that emphasized dispersal and protection of civilian populations. The Garden City movement and other planning innovations were partly responses to the lessons of wartime destruction. The development of international humanitarian law during the interwar period was a direct response to the atrocities and suffering of World War I. Organizations like the International Committee of the Red Cross worked to establish new standards for the treatment of prisoners of war, civilians, and wounded soldiers. However, these efforts were hampered by the reluctance of governments to accept limitations on their sovereignty and military effectiveness. The intelligence services that had been expanded during World War I became permanent features of modern states during the interwar period. The importance of code breaking, espionage, and counterintelligence had been demonstrated during the war, leading to the establishment of professional intelligence agencies in most major countries. These organizations would play crucial roles in the ideological conflicts of the interwar period and beyond. The logistics and supply systems that had been developed to support massive armies during World War I were adapted for civilian purposes during the interwar period. The techniques of mass production, inventory management, and transportation coordination that had been perfected for military purposes were applied to commercial enterprises, contributing to increased efficiency and productivity in many industries. The financial systems that had been created to fund World War I became permanent features of modern economies during the interwar period. Central banking, government borrowing, and currency management techniques that had been developed for wartime purposes were refined and institutionalized. The war had demonstrated that governments could mobilize enormous financial resources when necessary, and this capability would be crucial for dealing with the economic challenges of the interwar period. The scientific research that had been accelerated by military needs during World War I continued to advance during the interwar period, often with dual civilian and military applications. The development of new materials, communication technologies, and manufacturing processes that had been driven by wartime requirements found peacetime uses, while also contributing to the development of even more advanced weapon systems. The international trade patterns that had been disrupted by World War I were slowly rebuilt during the interwar period, but they remained vulnerable to political tensions and economic instability. The war had demonstrated how quickly global commerce could be disrupted by military conflict, leading to efforts to create more resilient trading relationships and alternative supply chains. The colonial administrations that had been expanded during World War I to mobilize resources from overseas territories faced new challenges during the interwar period. The principle of self-determination that had been applied to Europe was increasingly demanded by colonial peoples who had contributed to the war effort. The war had also demonstrated the military potential of colonial populations, making them both more valuable and more dangerous to their imperial rulers. The refugee problems that had been created by World War I and its aftermath continued to challenge international cooperation throughout the interwar period. Millions of people had been displaced by the war, the Russian Revolution, and the redrawing of national boundaries. The League of Nations and other international organizations struggled to provide assistance to these displaced populations, while also dealing with the political tensions their presence created. The public health challenges that had emerged during World War I, including the Spanish flu pandemic and the treatment of war-related disabilities, led to improvements in medical care and social services during the interwar period. The war had demonstrated the importance of public health measures and medical research, leading to increased government investment in healthcare infrastructure and disease prevention programs. The transportation systems that had been expanded during World War I to move troops and supplies were adapted for civilian use during the interwar period. The development of better roads, railways, and shipping facilities that had been driven by military needs contributed to economic growth and social mobility. However, these same transportation networks could also be used for military purposes, making them potential targets in future conflicts. The communication systems that had been developed during World War I to coordinate military operations were expanded and improved during the interwar period. The development of radio, telephone, and telegraph networks that had been accelerated by wartime needs transformed civilian communication and contributed to the creation of more integrated national and international communities. The energy systems that had been expanded during World War I to power military production were further developed during the interwar period to support economic growth and improved living standards. The war had demonstrated the strategic importance of energy resources, leading to increased exploration for oil and other fuels, while also spurring research into alternative energy sources. The manufacturing techniques that had been developed during World War I to produce weapons and equipment in unprecedented quantities were applied to civilian production during the interwar period. The principles of mass production, standardization, and quality control that had been perfected for military purposes contributed to increased productivity and lower costs for consumer goods. The organizational methods that had been developed to coordinate massive military operations during World War I were adapted for civilian purposes during the interwar period. The techniques of planning, coordination, and control that had been necessary to manage armies of millions were applied to large corporations, government agencies, and other complex organizations. The training and education systems that had been created during World War I to prepare soldiers for modern warfare were modified for civilian purposes during the interwar period. The emphasis on technical skills, physical fitness, and discipline that had been necessary for military effectiveness was applied to civilian education and job training programs. The research and development capabilities that had been expanded during World War I to create new weapons and equipment were redirected toward civilian purposes during the interwar period. The scientific and engineering expertise that had been mobilized for military purposes was applied to problems of industrial production, transportation, communication, and other civilian needs. The quality control and testing procedures that had been developed during World War I to ensure the reliability of military equipment were adapted for civilian manufacturing during the interwar period. The war had demonstrated the importance of standardization and quality assurance, leading to improved products and greater consumer confidence. The project management techniques that had been developed during World War I to coordinate complex military operations were applied to civilian construction and engineering projects during the interwar period. The ability to plan, schedule, and control large-scale projects that had been necessary for military success was transferred to civilian infrastructure development and industrial expansion. The personnel management systems that had been created during World War I to handle millions of soldiers were adapted for civilian organizations during the interwar period. The techniques of recruitment, training, evaluation, and promotion that had been developed for military purposes were applied to corporate and government employment practices. The information management systems that had been developed during World War I to handle the enormous flow of military intelligence and administrative data were adapted for civilian purposes during the interwar period. The techniques of data collection, analysis, and distribution that had been necessary for military effectiveness were applied to business intelligence and government administration. The security procedures that had been developed during World War I to protect military secrets and prevent sabotage were adapted for civilian purposes during the interwar period. The techniques of background investigation, access control, and counterintelligence that had been necessary for military security were applied to protecting industrial secrets and government information. By the late 1930s, it was becoming clear that the peace settlement that had ended World War I was breaking down irretrievably. The rise of aggressive dictatorships in Germany, Italy, and Japan, combined with the weakness of the democratic powers and the failure of international institutions, was creating conditions that made another world war increasingly likely. The lessons of World War I had been learned, but they had been learned selectively and often incorrectly. Military leaders had focused on the tactical and technical lessons while ignoring the strategic and political ones. Politicians had learned to fear war while failing to understand that the credible threat of force was sometimes necessary to maintain peace. The general public had learned that war was horrible while failing to recognize that some things might be worth fighting for. The generation that had fought in World War I was now in positions of leadership, but their memories of the war's horror made them reluctant to take the decisive action that might have prevented an even more destructive conflict. The appeasement policies of the 1930s were partly motivated by a genuine desire to avoid repeating the catastrophe of 1914 to 1918, but they failed to recognize that the new threats were fundamentally different from the old ones. The technological developments that had emerged from World War I had continued to evolve, making future conflicts potentially even more destructive than the previous war. The development of aircraft, tanks, and other weapon systems had proceeded rapidly during the interwar period, while new technologies like radar and improved communications were beginning to change the nature of warfare once again. The ideological conflicts that had emerged from the Russian Revolution and the rise of fascism had created new sources of international tension that were fundamentally different from the then traditional balance of power politics that had led to World War I. The struggle between democracy, communism, and fascism was not just about territory or resources, but about competing visions of how human society should be organized. The economic instability of the interwar period, culminating in the Great Depression, had created conditions that favored extremist political movements and aggressive foreign policies. The failure of democratic governments to deal effectively with economic problems had discredited liberal democracy in the eyes of many people, while the apparent success of authoritarian regimes in mobilizing resources and maintaining order made dictatorship seem attractive to those who valued stability over freedom. The breakdown of international cooperation that had begun with the failure of the League of Nations was accelerating as the 1930s progressed. The collective security system that was supposed to prevent aggression had proven ineffective when faced with determined aggressors, while the major democratic powers were increasingly focused on their own problems rather than international responsibilities. The arms race that had resumed in the 1930s was more dangerous than the pre-1914 competition because it involved not just larger quantities of traditional weapons, but entirely new categories of military technology. The development of strategic bombing aircraft, for example, meant that civilian populations would be vulnerable to attack in ways that had been impossible during World War I. The alliance system that was emerging in the late 1930s was more rigid and ideologically driven than the pre-1914 arrangements had been. The division between democratic and authoritarian powers was becoming more pronounced, making compromise and accommodation increasingly difficult. The flexibility that had sometimes allowed pre-war crises to be resolved through diplomacy was being replaced by ideological rigidity that made peaceful solutions less likely. The propaganda and mass communication techniques that had been developed during and after World War I were being used more systematically and effectively by the authoritarian regimes of the 1930s. Ability to shape public opinion and mobilize popular support that had been demonstrated during the war was being perfected by dictatorships that understood the importance of controlling information and manipulating emotions. The intelligence capabilities that had been developed during World War I were being expanded and refined during the 1930s as governments recognized the importance of information in modern warfare. The code-breaking successes of World War I had demonstrated the value of signals intelligence, while the development of new communication technologies created both opportunities and challenges for intelligence gathering. The industrial mobilization plans that were being developed in the late 1930s reflected the lessons of World War I about the importance of economic resources in modern warfare. Governments were creating detailed plans for converting civilian production to military purposes, stockpiling strategic materials, and coordinating industrial output with military requirements. The civil defense preparations that were being made in the late 1930s reflected the expectation that future wars would involve attacks on civilian populations. The development of strategic bombing aircraft had made it clear that the home front would be a battlefield in any future conflict, leading to preparations for air raid shelters, evacuation plans, and emergency services. As Europe moved inexorably toward another world war in 1939, it was clear that the peace settlement of 1919 had failed to create a stable international order. The war that was supposed to end all wars had instead created the conditions for an even more destructive conflict. The lessons of World War I had been learned, but they had been learned imperfectly and applied selectively, leading to policies and strategies that made another catastrophe more rather than less likely. The tragedy of the interwar period was not that another war was inevitable, but that the opportunities to prevent it were repeatedly missed or mishandled. The failure of the peace settlement was not predetermined, but was the result of specific decisions made by specific people who might have chosen differently. The breakdown of international cooperation, the rise of extremist movements, and the return of aggressive nationalism were all consequences of choices that could have been made differently. The ultimate lesson of World War I and its aftermath was that winning a war is easier than winning a peace. Military victory can be achieved through superior force and better strategy, but lasting peace requires wisdom, generosity, and a willingness to subordinate short-term interests to long-term stability. The victors of 1918 had the power to reshape the world, but they lacked the vision and the will to create a settlement that would endure. Instead, they created a peace that contained the seeds of its own destruction, ensuring that the war to end all wars would be followed by an even more terrible conflict. The human cost of this failure cannot be calculated merely in terms of the millions who would die in World War II, devastating as those losses were. The failure of the post-World War I settlement also meant the continuation of the cycle of violence and revenge that had characterized European politics for centuries. Each war created grievances that would fuel the next conflict, and each peace settlement created new injustices that would eventually demand redress through force. The institutional legacy of World War I was equally problematic. The League of Nations, despite its noble intentions, had proven incapable of maintaining peace when faced with determined aggressors. The principle of collective security had been tested and found wanting, while the concept of national self-determination had created as many problems as it solved. The international law that had been developed to regulate warfare had proven inadequate when confronted with regimes that rejected the entire concept of legal restraint. The economic legacy of World War I was perhaps even more destructive than its political consequences. The war had disrupted global trade patterns, destroyed productive capacity, and created debt burdens that would plague the international economy for decades. The reparation system had created a cycle of debt and resentment that contributed to economic instability and political extremism. The Great Depression, while not directly caused by World War I, was certainly made worse by the economic distortions and financial instability that the war had created. The social and cultural legacy of World War I was equally profound and long-lasting. The war had shattered faith in progress, civilization, and human nature itself. The optimism and confidence of the pre-war era had been replaced by cynicism and doubt that would characterize much of the 20th century. The lost generation of writers and artists had captured this disillusionment in works that would influence cultural development for decades to come. The technological legacy of World War I was perhaps the most ominous of all. The war had demonstrated that human ingenuity could be applied to destruction as effectively as to creation, and the pace of military innovation had accelerated dramatically. The weapons that had seemed so terrible in 1918 would appear primitive compared to those that would be developed for World War II and beyond. The war had opened a Pandora's box of military technology that could never be closed again. The psychological legacy of World War I affected not just the veterans who had fought in it, but entire societies that had been traumatized by the experience of total war. The concept of shell shock had been expanded to encompass entire populations that had been subjected to unprecedented levels of violence and destruction. The war had created a culture of violence and militarism that would persist long after the guns fell silent. The demographic legacy of World War I continued to affect European society throughout the interwar period and beyond. The loss of so many young men had created gender imbalances and generational gaps that would influence social development for decades. The decline in birth rates during the war years had created demographic hollows that would affect economic growth and military recruitment for generations to come. The environmental legacy of World War I was also significant, though it would not be fully understood until much later. The battlefields of the Western Front remained poisoned and scarred for decades after the war ended, while the massive consumption of resources had accelerated deforestation and industrial pollution. The war had demonstrated that human beings could alter their environment on a scale that was both unprecedented and potentially catastrophic. The medical legacy of World War I was more positive, as the advances in trauma surgery, prosthetics, and psychological treatment that had been developed to deal with war casualties were applied to civilian medicine. However, the war had also demonstrated the vulnerability of human beings to new forms of warfare, including poison gas and strategic bombing, that would make future conflicts even more destructive to civilian populations. The educational legacy of World War I was reflected in changes to curricula and teaching methods that emphasized technical training and scientific research. The war had demonstrated the importance of industrial capacity and technological innovation, leading to greater emphasis on science and engineering education. However, the war had also shown the dangers of nationalism and militarism, leading to efforts to promote international understanding and peaceful conflict resolution. The legal legacy of World War I included both positive and negative developments. On the positive side, the war had led to advances in international humanitarian law and the establishment of new institutions for international cooperation. On the negative side, the war had demonstrated the limitations of legal restraints when confronted with total war and ideological conflict. The concept of war crimes had been expanded, but the mechanisms for enforcing international law remained weak. The religious and philosophical legacy of World War I was profound and lasting. The war had raised fundamental questions about the nature of good and evil, the meaning of sacrifice, and the purpose of human existence that could not be easily answered. Some people found their faith strengthened by the experience of surviving the war, while others lost their belief in a benevolent deity who would allow such suffering. The war had challenged traditional religious and philosophical systems in ways that would influence intellectual development for decades to come. The artistic and literary legacy of World War I continued to influence cultural development throughout the 20th century and beyond. The themes of disillusionment, alienation, and the absurdity of modern life that had emerged from the war experience would be explored by successive generations of artists and writers. The war had created new forms of artistic expression and new ways of understanding the human condition that would have lasting impact. The political legacy of World War I was equally complex and contradictory. On one hand, the war had led to the expansion of democratic government and the recognition of new rights for women and minorities. On the other hand, the war had also created conditions that favored the rise of totalitarian movements and the breakdown of democratic institutions. The war had demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of democratic government under extreme stress. The military legacy of World War I was reflected in changes to military doctrine, organization, and technology that would influence warfare for decades to come. The concept of total war had been established, along with the recognition that future conflicts would involve entire societies rather than just professional armies. The importance of industrial capacity, technological innovation, and civilian morale had been demonstrated, leading to new approaches to military planning and preparation. The intelligence legacy of World War I was reflected in the establishment of permanent intelligence agencies and the development of new techniques for gathering and analyzing information. The importance of code breaking, espionage, and counterintelligence had been demonstrated, leading to increased investment in these capabilities. However, the war had also shown the limitations of intelligence when confronted with rapid technological change and ideological conflict. The logistical legacy of World War I was reflected in new approaches to supply chain management, transportation coordination, and resource allocation that would be applied to both military and civilian purposes. The war had demonstrated the importance of logistics in modern warfare, leading to new emphasis on planning and coordination. These lessons would be applied to economic development and industrial management during the interwar period. The financial legacy of World War I was reflected in new approaches to government finance, central banking, and international monetary cooperation. The war had demonstrated that governments could mobilize enormous financial resources when necessary, but it had also shown the dangers of excessive debt and monetary instability. The lessons learned would influence economic policy for decades to come, though they would not prevent the economic disasters of the interwar period. The diplomatic legacy of World War I was reflected in new approaches to international relations that emphasized multilateral cooperation and collective security. However, the failure of these approaches to prevent World War II would lead to further evolution in diplomatic practice and international organization. The war had demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of international cooperation in maintaining peace and security. The propaganda legacy of World War I was reflected in new techniques for mass communication and public persuasion that would be applied to both democratic and authoritarian purposes. The war had demonstrated the importance of public opinion in modern warfare, leading to increased emphasis on information warfare and psychological operations. These techniques would be refined and perfected during the interwar period and applied with devastating effect during World War II. The industrial legacy of World War I was reflected in new approaches to mass production, quality control, and technological innovation that would drive economic growth during the interwar period. The war had demonstrated the importance of industrial capacity in modern warfare, leading to increased investment in manufacturing and technology. However, the war had also shown how quickly industrial capacity could be converted from civilian to military purposes, making industrial development a double-edged sword. The scientific legacy of World War I was reflected in new approaches to research and development that emphasized practical applications and government support. The war had demonstrated the military potential of scientific research, leading to increased investment in science and technology. However, The war had also shown how scientific knowledge could be applied to destructive purposes, raising ethical questions that would persist throughout the 20th century and beyond. The transportation legacy of World War I was reflected in new approaches to logistics and mobility that would influence both military and civilian development. The war had demonstrated the importance of transportation in modern warfare, leading to increased investment in roads, railways, and other infrastructure. However, the war had also shown how transportation networks could be used for military purposes, making them potential targets in future conflicts. The communication legacy of World War I was reflected in new approaches to information sharing and coordination that would influence both military and civilian organizations. The war had demonstrated the importance of communication in modern warfare, leading to increased investment in telephone, radio, and other technologies. However, the war had also shown how communication networks could be intercepted and disrupted, leading to new emphasis on security and redundancy. The energy legacy of World War I was reflected in new approaches to resource development and strategic planning that would influence both military and civilian policy. The war had demonstrated the strategic importance of energy resources, leading to increased exploration and development of oil and other fuels. However, the war had also shown how energy supplies could be disrupted by military action, making energy security a permanent concern for governments and military planners. The manufacturing legacy of World War I was reflected in new approaches to production planning and quality control that would influence industrial development for decades to come. The war had demonstrated the importance of manufacturing capacity in modern warfare, leading to new emphasis on efficiency and standardization. However, the war had also shown how manufacturing capacity could be quickly converted from civilian to military purposes, making industrial policy a matter of national security. The organizational legacy of World War I was reflected in new approaches to management and coordination that would influence both military and civilian institutions. The war had demonstrated the importance of organization in managing complex operations, leading to new emphasis on planning and control. However, the war had also shown how organizations could be used for destructive purposes, raising questions about the relationship between efficiency and morality. The training legacy of World War I was reflected in new approaches to education and skill development that would influence both military and civilian institutions. The war had demonstrated the importance of training in modern warfare, leading to new emphasis on technical skills and physical fitness. However, the war had also shown how training could be used to prepare people for violence and destruction, raising questions about the purposes and methods of education. The research legacy of World War I was reflected in new approaches to knowledge, creation, and application that would influence both military and civilian development. The war had demonstrated the military potential of research and development, leading to increased investment in science and technology. However, the war had also shown how research could be applied to destructive purposes, raising ethical questions that would persist throughout the 20th century and beyond. As the world moved toward another global conflict in 1939, the lessons of World War I remained relevant, but were often misunderstood or misapplied. The war had demonstrated the destructive potential of modern technology and industrial organization, but it had also shown the resilience of human societies and the possibility of recovery from even the most devastating conflicts. The challenge for future generations would be to learn from the mistakes of the past while avoiding the trap of fighting the last war instead of preparing for the next one. The ultimate tragedy of World War I was not just the enormous cost in human lives and material resources, but the failure to create a lasting peace that would justify those sacrifices. The war had been fought to make the world safe for democracy, to end all wars, and to create a new international order based on justice and cooperation. Instead, it had created conditions that made future conflicts more likely and more destructive. The peace that followed the war was not a true peace, but merely an armistice in a longer conflict that would continue throughout the 20th century and beyond. The story of World War I and its aftermath is ultimately a story about the limitations of human wisdom and the persistence of human folly. Despite the enormous costs of the war and the obvious lessons that should have been learned from it, the world continued to make the same mistakes that had led to the conflict in the first place. The war had demonstrated the destructive potential of nationalism, militarism, and international rivalry, but these forces remained powerful throughout the interwar period and would eventually lead to an even more devastating conflict. The legacy of World War I continues to influence international relations and military affairs to this day. The concepts of total war, collective security, and international cooperation that emerged from the war remain central to contemporary thinking about conflict and peace. The technological innovations that were developed during the war laid the foundation for the military systems that would dominate the rest of the 20th century and beyond. The social and cultural changes that were accelerated by the war continue to shape modern society in ways that are still being understood and debated. Perhaps most importantly, World War I demonstrated that the price of failure in international relations can be catastrophically high. The war showed that small conflicts can escalate into global catastrophes, that technological progress can be applied to destructive as well as constructive purposes, and that the breakdown of international cooperation can have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate participants in any conflict. These lessons remain relevant today as the world faces new challenges and new threats that require international cooperation and wise leadership to address effectively. The centenary of World War I, marked in 2014 to 2018, provided an opportunity for reflection on the war's causes, conduct, and consequences. The passage of time has allowed historians to gain new perspectives on the conflict and to understand its place in the broader sweep of human history. However, the fundamental questions raised by the war about the nature of human conflict, the possibilities for international cooperation, and the relationship between technological progress and human welfare remain as relevant today as they were a century ago. The story of World War I is ultimately a cautionary tale about the dangers of nationalism, militarism, and international rivalry, but it is also a story about human resilience, courage, and the capacity for both destruction and creation. The war demonstrated the worst aspects of human nature, but it also showed the best: the willingness of ordinary people to sacrifice for their beliefs, the capacity of societies to endure enormous hardships, and the possibility of recovery and renewal even after the most devastating conflicts. As we continue to grapple with the challenges of international relations in the 21st century, the lessons of World War I remain relevant and important. The war showed that the costs of conflict can be enormous, that the benefits of peace are precious, and that the responsibility for maintaining international stability rests with all nations and all peoples. The war that was supposed to end all wars may have failed in that ambitious goal, but it did teach us valuable lessons about the price of failure and the importance of success in the ongoing struggle to create a more peaceful and just world.